People think getting lost begins the moment the trail disappears, but sometimes it begins years earlier when you fail to notice what has been standing beside you all along. The old envelope landed in the mud before either of us had time to react. Rain hammered against the trees so hard that I could barely hear my own breathing, but I still saw one thing with perfect clarity. My name was written across the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. Ethan Carter. Noah reached down almost instantly, his fingers closing around the weathered paper before I could pick it up. For a brief second our eyes met, and I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. It was not panic because we were lost. It was fear because I had almost seen something he had spent years trying to hide. "We need to keep moving," he said, slipping the envelope back inside his jacket as though nothing had happened. I wanted to ask about it, but another gust of wind pushed cold rain across the mountainside, forcing both of us to focus on finding shelter instead of answers. 3 days earlier, none of this had seemed possible. 3 days earlier, I believed Noah Brooks was simply my best friend. We had known each other since we were 12 years old. Our families met during a summer camping trip in the Cascade Mountains outside Seattle, and while the adults worried about tents and campfires, two awkward kids wandered farther into the woods than either of them realized. I remember the moment I looked around and discovered I could no longer hear my parents. Every tree looked exactly the same. I started crying because I honestly believed I would never find my way back. Noah was only a few yards away, yet he sounded calmer than any 12-year-old should have been. He pointed toward the evening sky, where the first bright star had appeared. "My grandpa says that is the North Star," he told me. "If we ever get lost again, we stay together and look up. We do not leave each other behind." It sounded like the kind of promise only children could make without realizing how important it might become someday. We found our families a few minutes later, but the promise stayed with us long. After the fear disappeared, years passed. School became college. College became careers. I became a graphic designer living in Seattle, always buried beneath deadlines and client meetings. Noah built a career that allowed him to spend more time outdoors than inside an office, which suited him perfectly because he had always been happiest surrounded by mountains, rivers, and pine trees. No matter how busy life became, we never missed our annual hiking trip. It was our tradition, our reset button, and the one weekend every year that reminded us we were still the same two friends who had once believed the North Star could solve every problem. The morning we left Seattle felt completely ordinary. Noah picked me up before sunrise with his truck already packed. We stopped at the same roadside diner we had visited for years, joked about who had forgotten something important, and argued over which playlist deserved the first hour of the drive. Looking back now, I realize Noah smiled a little less than usual. Several times he looked as though he wanted to tell me something, only to change the subject before speaking. I assumed he was tired. I assumed I would have another chance to ask. I had no idea that hidden inside his jacket was an old letter with my name on it, or that before this trip ended, everything I believed about our friendship would change forever. The highway slowly gave way to winding mountain roads, and with every mile the city felt farther behind us. Noah drove with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, while the other tapped quietly against the door in rhythm with the music playing through the speakers. We had made this drive so many times that neither of us needed a map until we reached the trailhead. The familiar scenery should have made everything feel routine, yet something was different. Noah was unusually quiet. Every now and then I caught him glancing toward the passenger seat as though he wanted to start a conversation, but each time he simply smiled and looked back at the road. I finally broke the silence by telling him that a company in San Francisco had offered me a position leading a larger design team. The words came out casually, because I had not made a decision yet, but I immediately noticed his fingers tighten around the steering wheel. He kept his eyes on the road for several seconds before asking if I was seriously considering it. I admitted that I was. It was a great opportunity, better pay, and a chance to work on projects I had always dreamed about. Noah nodded once and forced a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. He said it sounded like something I deserved. Then he changed the subject by asking whether I had remembered to pack enough extra batteries for my flashlight. The conversation felt unfinished, but I assumed he simply needed time to process the news. After parking at the trailhead, we checked our equipment the way we always did. We confirmed we had enough food for the weekend, nearly 2 gallons of water between us, a portable filter, a first aid kit, emergency blankets, waterproof matches, and paper maps sealed inside plastic sleeves. Noah also removed the old brass compass that had belonged to his grandfather. I laughed because he carried it on every trip, even though we both had GPS watches. He turned the compass over in his hand before slipping it into his pocket. "Batteries fail," he said. "Some things are worth trusting because they have never stopped working." The morning air was cool, and sunlight filtered gently through towering evergreens as we stepped onto the trail. Birds called from somewhere high above us, and the scent of damp pine needles filled the forest. We joked about how much slower we had become compared to our teenage hiking trips. Noah teased me for spending too much time behind a computer, and I reminded him that he was getting older too, even if he refused to admit it. For a while, everything felt exactly the way it always had. Around noon, we stopped beside a small creek to eat lunch. As we sat on a fallen log, Noah stared quietly at the rushing water. Without looking at me, he asked what I thought my life would look like 5 years from now. I shrugged and admitted that I had never been very good at making long-term plans. I figured life had a way of changing when least expected. He gave a thoughtful nod, almost as though my answer confirmed something he had already feared. Less than an hour later, the weather shifted faster than either of us had anticipated. Dark clouds rolled across the mountains, swallowing the bright blue sky. Wind swept through the trees with surprising force, and the temperature dropped enough for both of us to pull on rain jackets. We checked the forecast on our phones one last time before the signal disappeared completely. Noah studied the sky for a long moment and suggested we turn back early. I agreed without hesitation. We retraced our steps until a massive fallen tree blocked the trail we had crossed that morning. Fresh branches covered the ground, and heavy rain quickly erased footprints that might have guided us. Noah unfolded the paper map and then looked down at the brass compass in his hand. For the first time since I had known him, he took a slow breath before speaking. "I know where we should be," he said quietly, "but I do not know exactly where we are anymore." Rain continued falling through the towering evergreens as Noah folded the map and slipped it back inside its waterproof sleeve. Neither of us wasted time pretending everything was fine. We had enough experience outdoors to understand that panic solved nothing, but we also knew that confidence without a plan could be just as dangerous. Noah checked the compass again, compared it to the map, and slowly scanned the surrounding ridgeline through the curtain of rain. He explained that the storm had likely forced us farther off the marked trail than either of us realized, and that our safest choice was to stop moving before darkness made every direction look the same. I nodded, even though my heart was beating much faster than I wanted him to notice. We still had food, dry clothes packed inside waterproof bags, emergency blankets, and enough supplies to stay safe if we remained calm. The problem was not surviving one night. The problem was not knowing exactly where we would begin tomorrow. We searched carefully until we found a large cedar tree whose wide trunk created a surprisingly dry space beneath its massive branches. Working together without needing many words, we stretched our lightweight tarp between sturdy limbs, secured the corners with paracord, and gathered small pieces of dry wood protected beneath fallen logs. Noah managed to start a modest campfire using waterproof matches, and the warm glow immediately made the gray forest feel less intimidating. Steam slowly rose from our jackets as they dried beside the flames. For the first time since the storm began, neither of us said anything. We simply listened to the rain tapping against the tarp while the fire crackled softly between us. Eventually, I admitted what had been sitting heavily in my mind. I told Noah that I had never actually been lost before, not like this. I had always assumed that trails, maps, and technology would keep everything under control. Noah smiled gently without making fun of me. He stared into the fire for a moment before speaking. "Most people think getting lost happens all at once," he said quietly. "Sometimes it happens one small decision at a time." His words stayed with me longer than I expected. I asked him if he was worried, hoping he would finally admit that this situation frightened him too. Instead, he looked directly at me and said that worrying about the weather would not help either of us. The only thing that mattered was making good decisions one at a time. There was something steady about the way he spoke that slowed my breathing almost immediately. I realized he had done this my entire life. Whenever I panicked before exams, job interviews, or difficult family conversations, Noah somehow always knew exactly what to say. I had never questioned why he seemed to understand me so easily. I had simply accepted it as part of who he was. As darkness settled over the forest, We ate a simple dinner of trail mix, beef jerky, and energy bars while discussing our plan for sunrise. If the rain stopped, we would climb toward higher ground, look for familiar landmarks, and follow the nearest reliable water source if necessary. It sounded reasonable enough to let both of us rest. The fire burned lower, and exhaustion finally caught up with me. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag beneath the tarp and drifted into an uneasy sleep while rain continued falling beyond our small shelter. Sometime during the night, I woke without knowing why. The fire had faded into glowing embers, and the forest had become almost completely silent. Noah was still awake. He sat alone near the edge of the shelter holding the old envelope in both hands. The firelight illuminated my name written across the front as he stared at it with an expression filled with quiet sadness. For a long moment, he looked as though he might place the letter into the dying fire, but instead he closed his eyes, slipped it carefully back inside his jacket, and whispered something too soft for me to hear. Morning arrived with a pale gray sky and the welcome sound of rain finally fading into scattered drops falling from the branches above us. The forest looked completely different than it had the day before. Mist drifted slowly between the towering evergreens, and every rock, fallen log, and patch of moss glistened beneath the weak sunlight pushing through the clouds. Noah was already awake when I unzipped my sleeping bag. He had quietly packed most of our shelter and was heating water for instant oatmeal over the small stove we carried for emergencies. He handed me a warm cup without saying much, but somehow he already knew I would need it before I even asked. That had always been Noah. He noticed the little things before anyone else did. After breakfast, we carefully reviewed the map again. Noah explained that climbing toward higher ground would give us a better chance of spotting familiar landmarks. We marked our direction with bright survey tape so we could avoid accidentally walking in circles, then began moving slowly through the damp forest. The ground was still slippery from the storm, and every step demanded attention. About an hour later, I planted my foot on what looked like solid ground, only to feel it slide across a patch of wet roots hidden beneath fallen leaves. I caught myself before falling completely, but my right ankle twisted awkwardly beneath me. A sharp ache shot through my leg, forcing me to sit on the nearest rock. Noah was beside me almost instantly. He knelt without hesitation and asked me exactly where it hurt. After checking carefully, he gave a relieved smile and said it appeared to be only a mild sprain. He wrapped the ankle with an elastic bandage from our first aid kit, adjusted the laces on my hiking boot for extra support, and quietly shifted several heavier items from my backpack into his own without making it seem like a favor. When I protested that he was carrying too much, he simply shrugged and said we would move at whatever pace kept both of us safe. We continued much more slowly than before. Every few minutes Noah glanced back to make sure I was comfortable, never rushing me or sounding impatient. As the hours passed, I began noticing things that somehow had escaped my attention for years. He always remembered that I preferred the water bottle clipped to the left side of my pack instead of the right. He handed me my favorite trail snacks before I realized I was hungry. When the sun briefly appeared through the trees, he reminded me to put on sunscreen because he knew I always forgot. None of those moments seemed extraordinary by themselves, yet together they formed a pattern I had somehow never examined. During a short rest beside a fallen cedar, I asked him why he had never stayed in a serious relationship for very long. He smiled quietly while looking out across the trees. After a long pause, he answered that sometimes a person spends so much time hoping for one impossible future that every other possibility feels incomplete. I assumed he was talking about an old relationship that had ended badly, so I nodded with sympathy and did not ask another question. Looking back now, I wish I had understood what he was trying to tell me. As evening approached, we reached a rocky overlook where the clouds had finally begun to break apart. The view stretched across miles of untouched forest, but there was still no road, no ranger station, and no sign that we were close to finding our way home. We prepared another simple camp beneath a cluster of tall pines, and while the last light faded from the sky, Noah stared quietly into the growing darkness before turning toward me with an expression I could not quite read. "Ethan," he said softly, "what would you do if someone you trusted had been hiding the truth from you for 10 years? For several seconds I did not answer Noah's question because I honestly believed he was talking about someone else. The fire burned quietly between us, sending small sparks into the cool evening air while the last traces of daylight disappeared behind the mountains. I looked at him and shrugged, telling him that it would depend on the reason for the secret. If someone had hidden the truth to protect another person, I thought forgiveness would probably come easier than anger. Noah lowered his eyes toward the flames and gave a slow nod, but he did not continue the conversation. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything we had shared before. The next morning we packed our camp early and continued moving downhill toward the sound of running water. Noah explained that streams often led toward larger rivers, roads, or ranger access points. It was the most logical plan we had, so I trusted his judgment. We walked carefully across uneven ground, marking our route whenever possible. Around midday, we both stopped at the exact same moment. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound echoed through the forest. It was low and irregular, almost like the distant hum of an engine. My heart immediately jumped with hope. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Noah listened carefully before nodding. Without wasting another second, we headed toward the sound, weaving between towering pines and climbing over fallen logs with renewed energy. Every step made me believe we were getting closer to help. The noise grew louder for several minutes before gradually fading again. When we finally reached the source, we found nothing more than a narrow canyon where rushing water forced its way through layers of smooth stone. The echoes had transformed the current into something that sounded almost mechanical from a distance. I stood there staring at the water, unable to hide my disappointment. It felt as though the forest itself had played a cruel trick on us, offering hope only to quietly take it away. Frustration that had been building since the storm finally escaped before I could stop it. I asked Noah why we had chosen this longer route instead of one of our usual trails. I said that if we had stayed with our original plan, none of this would have happened. The words left my mouth harder than I intended. Noah remained silent for a moment, then looked at me with an expression that carried more sadness than anger. He said he had chosen this trail because he believed it would give us uninterrupted time together before my possible move to San Francisco changed everything. He admitted that the thought of seeing me less often had stayed in his mind for months, even though he had never found the courage to say it aloud. His honesty immediately dissolved my frustration, replacing it with guilt. I apologized for blaming him, explaining that I had spoken out of fear rather than fairness. Noah accepted the apology with a small smile, but I could still see something weighing on him. Slowly, he reached inside his jacket and removed the old envelope I had seen during the storm. The paper looked worn from years of careful handling, its edges softened by time. He turned it over in his hands before looking directly at me. "I wrote this when I was 17, he said quietly. "I carried it today because I thought this weekend might be my last chance." Before I could ask what he meant, dark clouds gathered once again above the trees, and a sudden roll of thunder echoed across the mountains. Noah slipped the envelope safely back inside his jacket as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. "We need shelter first," he said softly. "After that, I promise I will tell you everything." The second storm passed much faster than the first one. By late evening, the rain had faded into a light drizzle, leaving the forest wrapped in a quiet mist that reflected the soft glow of our campfire. Above us, the clouds slowly drifted apart until a handful of familiar stars appeared through the opening sky. Noah looked upward for a long moment before quietly saying that he had almost forgotten how bright the mountains looked after a storm. I followed his gaze until I found the North Star shining above the dark outline of the trees. Instantly, I remembered two frightened 12-year-old boys making a promise they barely understood. Noah reached into his jacket once more and carefully removed the weathered envelope. This time he did not hide it. He held it gently between both hands, as though it contained something fragile that had survived far longer than anyone expected. "I tried to throw this away more than once," he admitted. "Every time I convinced myself it was finally time to let go, I could not do it." He slowly opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of faded paper. The handwriting looked younger than the man sitting across from me, yet unmistakably belonged to him. He smiled faintly before shaking his head. "I cannot read this exactly the way I wrote it. The person who wrote these pages was 17 years old. I think you deserve to hear the truth from the person I became instead." He folded the letter again and rested it on his knee. The fire cracked softly between us while the forest remained perfectly still, almost as though everything around us had paused to listen. Noah took a slow breath before finally speaking. I have loved you since we were 16 years old, Ethan. The words settled into the silence with surprising gentleness. There was no drama in his voice, no expectation, only quiet honesty. He explained that what had started as admiration slowly became something deeper during high school. Every year, he hoped the feelings would fade. Every year, they only became stronger. He dated other people because he believed it was the responsible thing to do. But none of those relationships ever lasted because part of his heart had already chosen someone else. He looked at me with the same steady expression I had trusted my entire life. I never told you because losing the chance to be your friend felt worse than carrying the secret, he said. Watching you build your life while standing beside you was enough. I convinced myself that it had to be enough. My thoughts raced through memories that suddenly looked completely different. Every late-night phone call after a difficult day, every birthday he somehow made special, every family holiday where he quietly made sure I never felt alone, every hike, every laugh, every moment I had accepted without question now carried a meaning I had never imagined. Noah continued before I could respond. He said he had brought the letter because he believed I would probably move to San Francisco, and he could not bear the idea of watching me leave without at least knowing the truth. Then the storm had trapped us in the mountains, reminding him how unpredictable life could become. Getting lost out here frightened me, he admitted softly. But not as much as the thought of losing you without ever telling you how much you have meant to me. He lowered his eyes and carefully placed the folded letter beside the fire. I am not asking you to say anything tonight, he continued. You do not owe me an answer. You do not owe me the same feelings. I only wanted you to know the truth before we found our way home. I stared at the fire, unable to speak. My heart was filled with emotions I could not separate or understand. Everything I believed about my past had shifted in a single conversation, and yet somehow the person sitting across from me still felt exactly like the Noah I had always trusted. The only difference was that now I finally understood why he had never once let me face the hardest moments of my life alone. Neither of us spoke for what felt like several minutes. The fire continued burning quietly between us while the North Star remained fixed above the clearing, exactly where Noah had pointed all those years ago when we were frightened children pretending that a single promise could keep us safe forever. I wanted to say something meaningful, something that would make sense of everything he had just shared, but every sentence I imagined sounded incomplete. My mind kept drifting through memories that suddenly refused to stay the same. I remembered the night my father underwent surgery and Noah appeared at the hospital carrying coffee for my mother before anyone even asked him to come. I remembered losing my first apartment after a plumbing disaster, only to find Noah already loading boxes into his truck before I finished explaining what had happened. I remembered birthdays, holidays, job interviews, breakups, family dinners, quiet weekends, and countless ordinary moments where he had simply been there without expecting anything in return. For years I had called that loyalty. Now I realized it had always been something much deeper. Noah finally broke the silence by standing up and taking a few slow steps away from the fire. He looked toward the dark forest rather than at me, almost as though he wanted to give me room to think without feeling watched. That simple gesture somehow said more than any speech could have. Even after revealing the biggest secret of his life, he was still protecting my comfort before his own. I suddenly understood how exhausting that must have been. Noah, I said quietly. He stopped walking but did not turn around immediately. When he finally looked back, I could see uncertainty in his eyes for the first time since we had met as children. I took a slow breath, searching for words that felt honest. I cannot tell you that I understand everything tonight, I admitted. I cannot pretend I have sorted through feelings that I never realized I needed to examine. He nodded gently without interrupting. But I also cannot pretend this changes nothing, I continued. Every memory I have keeps rearranging itself inside my head. Noah lowered his eyes, giving me space to continue at my own pace. I asked him if there had ever been a moment when he almost told me before now. A small smile crossed his face. He laughed softly and admitted there had been dozens. He almost confessed after my college graduation, after I landed my first full-time job, after I helped him move into his first apartment, and after every hiking trip where he convinced himself the next year would somehow be easier. Each time he chose silence because seeing me happy mattered more than hearing the answer he feared. Listening to him only made my chest feel heavier. I realized that while I had never intentionally ignored him, I had also never stopped to ask why he remembered every little detail about my life, when I often forgot simple things about my own schedule. I slowly stood and walked over until we were only a few feet apart. Without really planning it, I reached out and took his hand. He looked genuinely surprised, but did not pull away. His hand felt cold from the mountain air, steady despite everything he had just risked. I do not know exactly where this road leads, I said honestly, but I know one thing with complete certainty. I am not walking away from you. Noah closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though he had been holding his breath for years and had finally remembered how to breathe again. Neither of us said another word after that. We simply stood beneath the stars in the quiet mountain air, our hands still joined, while somewhere beyond the darkness the path home was waiting for us to find it together. The next morning the forest felt different. The air was crisp, the sky was finally clear, and sunlight filtered through the tall evergreens in long golden beams that reached the damp ground below. For the first time since the storm had begun, I could hear birds instead of rain. Noah and I packed our camp in comfortable silence. Nothing between us felt awkward, but neither of us rushed to define what had changed. His confession still echoed through my mind, and my own promise not to walk away remained the only answer I was ready to give. Somehow that seemed enough for both of us. Before leaving, Noah folded the old letter carefully and placed it back inside his jacket. He did not hide it anymore. He simply carried it as part of his story. We continued downhill, following the steady sound of flowing water exactly as we had planned. The creek gradually widened into a stronger stream, and the terrain became easier to navigate. My ankle still ached from the previous day, but the swelling had gone down enough that walking felt much easier. Noah still adjusted his pace to match mine without mentioning it, and I caught myself smiling because I finally understood that every small act of patience had always been an expression of love. Around midday, we noticed faded orange paint on the trunk of an old cedar tree. Noah stopped immediately and brushed away a layer of moss with his hand. Beneath it was an official trail marker, weathered but unmistakable. We looked at each other for a second before laughing with the kind of relief that only comes after believing you might never see home again. The trail was overgrown from recent storms, but it was real. We followed it carefully until the narrow path gradually widened into a maintained route. Less than an hour later, we heard distant voices calling through the trees. Noah answered loudly, and within minutes 2 park rangers appeared around a bend in the trail. They greeted us with calm professionalism, explained that our families had reported us missing after losing contact, and confirmed that search teams had begun covering several sections of the mountain that morning. They checked my ankle, made sure neither of us needed medical attention, and guided us back toward the ranger station where warm drinks and dry blankets were waiting. Standing inside the small wooden building felt strangely unreal. Phones buzzed with missed calls and messages from worried family members. Relief filled every conversation, yet beneath all of it another quiet reality remained between Noah and me. He never mentioned the letter again. He never asked what I was feeling. He simply gave me the same patient kindness he always had, refusing to pressure me into finding answers before I was ready. On the drive back toward Seattle, the mountains slowly disappeared behind us. Neither of us turned on the radio. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. About an hour outside the city, I asked Noah to pull over at a scenic overlook where the highway crossed above a broad valley. We stepped out of the truck and leaned against the wooden fence while cool afternoon wind moved through the trees below. I stared at the mountains stretching across the horizon and finally admitted something I had not even confessed to myself. I told Noah that the job in San Francisco had never really been about ambition. Part of me had wanted a fresh start because I believed something was missing from my life, even though I could never explain what it was. Then I looked at him and smiled. I think I finally understand what I was searching for, I said quietly. If you are willing, I would like our first real date to happen somewhere that does not involve getting lost in the woods. Noah laughed harder than I had heard him laugh in years, and in that moment I realized we had finally found the road that mattered most. 1 year later, we stood at the very edge of the same mountain meadow where everything had changed. This time the sky was clear from sunrise, wildflowers covered the open field with bright colors, and every step toward the clearing felt lighter than the last. We had planned the trip carefully, leaving our itinerary with family, carrying updated navigation equipment, satellite communication, extra supplies, and enough preparation to make the journey feel like an adventure instead of a risk. Noah laughed when he noticed me checking the map for the third time before we even reached the trail. I smiled back and reminded him that some lessons only needed to be learned once. He nodded in complete agreement. During the past year, our lives had changed in ways neither of us could have imagined while sitting beside that campfire. We discovered that moving from lifelong friendship into a relationship did not happen in a single perfect moment. It happened through hundreds of ordinary days. We learned how to communicate honestly instead of assuming the other person already understood. We learned that breakfast dates before work could become just as meaningful as weekend hikes through the mountains. We learned that every difficult conversation became easier because we had already survived the hardest one beneath the North Star. There were awkward moments, quiet adjustments, and plenty of laughter whenever one of us caught the other slipping back into old habits of hiding feelings instead of sharing them. None of it made our relationship weaker. Every honest conversation made it stronger. As we reached the center of the meadow, Noah stopped beside the same fallen log where we had once watched the stars after the storm. The place no longer reminded me of fear. It reminded me of courage. I reached into my backpack and carefully removed a small wooden frame wrapped in soft cloth. Inside was the old letter Noah had carried for nearly 10 years. After we returned home, he had finally allowed me to read every word. The handwriting belonged to a hopeful 17-year-old who believed his feelings would probably remain a secret forever, yet every sentence carried the same kindness that had always defined the man standing beside me. Behind the framed letter, I had placed another page written in my own handwriting. At the top, I had written one simple sentence. You waited 10 years to tell me. I needed 1 year to answer you the right way. Noah read the page quietly before looking at me with eyes that had become impossible for me to imagine living without. I reached into my jacket and removed a small ring box. His expression changed from surprise to complete disbelief. Before I could say anything, he laughed softly and reached into his own backpack. He held up another small ring box. We both stood there smiling, realizing we had planned the exact same surprise without telling each other. The laughter echoed across the peaceful meadow until neither of us could stop smiling. I opened my box first and asked Noah if he would spend the rest of his life continuing the promise we made when we were 12 years old, never leaving each other behind no matter where life carried us. He answered yes before I had completely finished speaking. Then he opened his own box and admitted that he had planned to ask the same question. We exchanged rings, each wearing the one chosen by the other, and somehow that felt more meaningful than either plan alone. As the afternoon slowly faded toward evening, we stood together looking up until the first bright point of light appeared above the mountains. The North Star had not changed since two frightened boys found comfort beneath its quiet glow, but we had. We never fell in love because we became lost in the woods. We discovered our love because the mountains gave us enough silence to finally hear the truth that had been guiding us home all along.